Dawn spilled like molten bronze over the Solomon Islands, the ocean below gleaming like hammered metal. At 18,000 feet inside the cramped cockpit, thick with sweat and gasoline, Lieutenant Richard Bong watched his wingman's P-38 Lightning spin, out of control, corkscrewing into the Pacific like a silver nail. 3 Japanese Zeros had dropped out of the sun, ambushing them from above. Now Bong was alone, the lead Zero sliding neatly into firing position behind him. He did exactly what the flight manual said: hard right, bank full throttle, climb out of the danger zone. But the Zero could turn tighter, always tighter. The radio hissed static, and Bong knew he had maybe 4 seconds before 20mm shells tore through his plane. What happened next wasn't in any manual. Bong rolled his Lightning completely inverted and shoved the control yoke forward. Instead of climbing, the aircraft dove straight toward the sea. But because he was upside down, the dive pulled him away at an angle the Zero pilot never expected. His body screamed in protest. Blood surged to his head. The edges of his vision went red, the world bleeding into color in pain. The gauges blurred. The supercharger's whine rose into a single metallic shriek that filled the cockpit. For 2 endless seconds he could barely see, flying blind on instinct and the muscle memory of a farm boy from Wisconsin who had once learned to track wild geese by the wind. Then suddenly, clarity. At 12,000 feet, Bong rolled level again. The Zero shot past above him, overshooting the target completely. Bong had survived. And in that instant, he had stumbled onto something that would quietly rewrite the art of air combat across the Pacific. This maneuver broke every rule ever taught at the training bases in California and Arizona. Flight instructors had drilled it in: never go -G, never risk engine flameout, never pull an inverted dive. Yet here, over the dark water, those warnings meant nothing. Between the manual and survival, Bong chose survival, and in doing so, created a tactic born not from theory, but from the raw mathematics of desperation. From above, the islands looked like blades of green metal scattered across the sea. Below, the Pacific stretched black and endless. Inside the cockpit, Bong's body trembled, his heart hammering against his harness. In those 4 seconds, he had discovered a brutal truth every pilot would soon face: between the safety of rules and the chaos of war, sometimes you had to fly directly toward death just to slip past it. It wasn't a maneuver in any book. It was instinct, pure, terrified instinct, rewriting the laws of flight in midair. What would you have done in Bong's place 4 seconds from death, upside down over the Pacific? Comment your name, where you're watching from, and your thoughts on his choice. I read them all. Your perspective keeps these forgotten moments alive. Training bases in California and Arizona had drilled the same message into every young pilot: avoid -G flight at all costs. The warnings were everywhere on chalkboards in flight manuals, even scribbled in the margins of briefing notes. -Gs could starve an engine of fuel, tear apart a plane's frame, or black out a pilot before he even had time to eject. It was the gospel of peacetime aviation, neat, logical, and fatally out of date. In those pre-war classrooms, the air smelled of chalk dust and motor oil. Cadets practiced turns on wooden mock cockpits, instructors pointing with a ruler: positive Gs, good, -Gs, bad. On weekends, they'd lounge under the desert sun, confident they were learning every trick to survive. Yet over the Solomon Islands, over Rabaul, over New Guinea, those same cadets, now veterans in sweat-soaked flight suits, were discovering that the rules written in safety manuals didn't mean much when a Zero had its guns lined up on your spine. Aviation medicine in 1942 was still guesswork in a lab coat. Doctors at Wright Field had tested -G tolerance on volunteers in cushioned centrifuges, not in combat. Reports claimed that at -2 Gs, the human eye could hemorrhage. At -3, consciousness might fade. So the official policy was absolute: never invert, never push over. But war rewrites policy fast. 2 seconds of blindness and a splitting headache meant survival. Perfect flight discipline meant a funeral with no body to bury. It wasn't just physiology that was being tested. It was faith in authority. Air combat was revealing an uncomfortable truth doctrine kills when the enemy doesn't play by it. The Japanese had thrown out the rulebook years earlier, refining their craft over China, learning to exploit every ounce of the Zero's agility. Meanwhile, American pilots fought like students, taking an exam on old material. They clung to formation patterns and approved maneuvers, even when those habits turned them into predictable targets. Imagine it: a young pilot, 22 years old, remembers his instructor's words, echoing through his mind, "Never go negative. G." Behind him, tracer rounds arc closer white threads across a blue sky. He has two choices: follow the rules or follow instinct. One keeps his conscience clean. The other keeps him alive. By 1943, that quiet rebellion pilots ignoring what they'd been taught was spreading faster than any memo could stop. The textbook said, "Stability saves lives." The war was proving the opposite: survival belonged to the men willing to destabilize everything: the airframe, the body, even the definition of courage itself. The flight schools had taught them to fly like machines. The Pacific was teaching them to fly like survivors. By 1942, the Zero had become a phantom that haunted Allied pilots from the Philippines to Guadalcanal. The Mitsubishi A6M wasn't just another airplane. It was a flying paradox, light as a whisper, deadly as a knife. Below 300 miles per hour, it could outturn almost anything in the sky. Its radius of turn was tighter than a Wildcat's, smaller than a Lightning's, and when flown by the combat-hardened aces of the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was almost unbeatable in a traditional dogfight. American training manuals still glorified the turning duel, a relic of World War I. Pilots were told to circle to fight inside the ring, against a Zero that was suicide. The first reports from the Philippines and Java read like obituaries: pilots diving on Zeros, missing their first burst, then trying to turn back in pursuit, only to watch the enemy spiral inside their arc line, up a perfect shot and cut them down within seconds. Some sectors reported kill ratios of 3-1 against the Americans. To understand why, you have to picture the mindset of Japanese aviators in those early years. Many had fought over China since the late 1930s. They weren't just warriors. They were craftsmen, honing tactics like a swordsmith folds steel. They studied the enemy's habits, how an American fighter would instinctively try to climb out or bank away when threatened, and they built traps around those reflexes. A favorite trick was cruel in its simplicity. 1 Zero flew straight and level, feigning weakness. When an American committed to the attack, 2 more Zeros would drop from above, slicing in from the flanks. The hunter became the hunted before he even realized the bait had been set. Meanwhile, American aircraft designers had built planes that reflected a different philosophy. The F-4F Wildcat could dive fast and take a beating, but it rolled sluggishly. The P-40 Warhawk was tough and steady in a climb, but lost its edge at high altitudes. The P-38 Lightning was a twin-engine powerhouse with heavy guns, but its wide turning circle made it clumsy in a knife fight. The designers had prioritized armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and survivability. The Japanese had stripped all that away for one thing: agility. The result was a duel of opposites: endurance versus finesse, safety versus speed. A Zero pilot once said, "Our armor is our skill." He wasn't wrong. In the early Pacific War, that skill was carving through squadrons trained for a different era. By mid-1942, American commanders were filing blunt reports. "We cannot win turning fights against this aircraft." The math of air combat was unforgiving. Whoever could pull the tighter circle won. The Americans needed a new geometry, a way to turn the fight vertical, to add gravity and surprise into the equation. That new geometry was still a year away, hidden inside a maneuver no one dared to teach. But desperation was already drawing the blueprint. The maneuver that would upend this deadly equation didn't come from an engineer's drafting table or an Air Corps tactics manual. It came from panic and from a few men who refused to die according to the rules. They called it the split S. To understand it, imagine rolling your plane completely upside down, then pulling forward on the stick, diving through an arc that turns altitude into speed. In positive G flight, blood is forced toward your feet. Vision narrows, the edges go gray. But in negative G flight, when you're inverted and pushing through a dive, blood surges to your head. The world turns crimson. Pilots called it a redout. For 2 or 3 seconds you could barely see. The instruments melted into haze. You were flying blind, trusting muscle memory and instinct alone. Aviation medicine of the time said that was impossible to endure. Laboratory studies from Wright Field concluded that even -2 Gs could cause unbearable pain or temporary blindness. But those tests didn't involve Zeros firing 20mm shells at your tail. Combat introduced a different calculus. 2 seconds of agony were better than dying in a textbook perfect maneuver. What made the Split S brilliant wasn't just its defiance of biology, it was how it broke the enemy's expectations. When a Zero pilot slipped behind an American, he predicted 2 likely moves. The target would either try to outturn him hopeless or climb away worse. But rolling, inverted, and diving, that was madness. It forced the Zero to react in an axis where its greatest advantage, tight horizontal turns, became useless. The American traded altitude for speed, and in that vertical space, the Hunter's geometry collapsed. The trick worked for another reason. The engineers hadn't planned the P-38's twin Allison engines could keep running under negative Gs, while carbureted Japanese and British engines often sputtered or died in inverted flight. Lockheed hadn't designed it that way. It was a lucky accident of technology meeting necessity. For the Zero, whose lightweight frame was stressed for positive Gs following a steep negative dive, was a gamble. Push too hard, and the wings could flutter or snap. Try to match the P-38's descent, and the engine might choke. So the Japanese pilot often had to pull out early, and that brief hesitation was all the escape a man like Bong needed. Physically, the Split S was torture. Blood vessels burst in the eyes. Headaches hammered behind the skull. But as one pilot put it in a post-mission debrief, "I'd rather have a pounding headache than a funeral with no body." It was primitive physics and raw instinct, a 2-second act of faith. And yet, it was enough to change the balance of survival in the Pacific sky. April 11th, 1943. The skies over Huon Gulf shimmered with heat, the clouds hanging like bruises above the green coastline of New Guinea. Major Thomas Lynch, leading a 4-ship patrol of P-38 Lightnings from Port Moresby, spotted 8 Zeros closing in from 20,000 feet. He had read the reports, heard the warnings, don't try to turn with them. But when the enemy leader dropped in behind him, that advice was no longer a theory. It was death, seconds away. Lynch didn't hesitate. He rolled his Lightning inverted and shoved the stick forward, diving straight down through the blue. His engines howled as the airspeed needle swung past 400 miles per hour. The sky blurred. Gravity flipped. Somewhere above him, the Zero tried to follow, then broke off its frame, shuddering, its pilot forced to pull out early. When Lynch leveled off at 8,000 feet, the world was silent, except for the deep, smooth growl of his twin Allisons. He had survived, but he didn't stop there. Using the speed he'd gained, Lynch pulled back into a climb, circling under the Japanese formation, now scattered and disorganized. In moments, he was behind them. 2 short bursts from his cannons, and 2 Zeros spiraled down in flames. His wingmen, having watched and copied his maneuver, returned to base, untouched. That day marked the first deliberate use of the inverted dive tactic. Other pilots had stumbled upon it by accident, but Lynch had chosen it, tested it, and proven it could be repeated. The after-action report mentioned the event in a single dry sentence, but among the men of the 39th Fighter Squadron, it spread like gospel. That evening in the humid mess tent at Port Moresby, Lynch stood before a group of pilots crowded around a rough sketch on a crate lid. "If a Zero gets on your tail," he said, tapping the chalk line, "don't turn with him, go vertical. Roll over, pull through, dive like hell, then use the speed to climb back up." The advice was simple, almost reckless. But for the men who had been losing friends week after week, it sounded like salvation. Outside, the jungle steamed in the fading light. Mechanics wiped oil from their hands, and the scent of gasoline mixed with rain. In the distance, a new pilot, barely 20, was still shaking, rubbing the red spots around his eyes, where blood vessels had burst during his first inverted dive. "Hurts like hell," he muttered. A veteran next to him grinned tiredly. "Yeah, but it means you're still breathing." Lynch didn't care about the risk. He cared that it worked. In a war where the enemy had rewritten the rules, he had just written one back. And it would travel far from this jungle airfield to every squadron in the Pacific, whispered from pilot to pilot, like a secret handshake between men who'd looked death in the eyes and pulled through the red haze. By the summer of 1943, the inverted dive had become the worst-kept secret in the Southwest Pacific. It wasn't in any manual, and you'd never find it in an official briefing, but every new pilot who arrived in New Guinea learned it before his first mission. The instruction didn't come from officers or engineers. It came in the mess tents in the smoky ready rooms on the back of ration boxes. A veteran would grab a pencil sketch, a rough loop, and say, "When he's on your tail and you've got nowhere left to go, flip it over and go down. Hard." It was a gospel passed mouth to mouth, heart to heart, between men who had seen what happened when you tried to play by the book. The Pacific was rewriting the laws of flight, and survival was the only curriculum. Major Charles McDonald, of the 475th Fighter Group, one of the theater's leading aces, credited that move for saving his life more than once. His reports from late 1943 followed a pattern dive from altitude, make one high-speed pass, and if counterattacked during the climb roll, inverted and dive away to reset the fight. "It's not graceful," he told a new pilot, "but it keeps you alive." But survival had its price. The human body wasn't built for negative Gs. Every time a pilot pulled through an inverted dive, blood flooded his head like a flash flood, bursting a dam. Tiny red capillaries snapped under the skin. His eyes throbbed, his face peppered with dark dots. Flight surgeon Captain James Moorhead at Henderson Field examined dozens of pilots who used the maneuver often. Nearly all showed burst blood vessels, subconjunctival hemorrhages that turned the whites of their eyes crimson. "They look like demons," he wrote in his notebook, "but they're very much alive." Headaches, nausea, blurred vision, these became routine. And still, the men kept doing it. Because the choice was simple: 2 seconds of blindness and pain, or eternity in the Pacific. There were rules of thumb that veterans passed along with the maneuver. Never go inverted below 8,000 feet, unless you're already dead on paper. Don't yank the stick too hard, the readout lasts longer. Memorize your instruments. You'll have to fly blind for 3 seconds. If you see the ocean before you see your altimeter, you waited too long. In the glow of lanterns after a mission, young pilots sat with older ones trading the unspoken truths that no headquarters would ever approve. The official doctrine said, "Stability saves lives." Experience whispered back, "Stability kills if you cling to it too long." Squadron commanders knew what was happening. Some quietly encouraged it. Others looked the other way, maintaining plausible deniability. They all understood the reality in the Pacific. Innovation didn't come from laboratories or offices. It came from the men still breathing after their first close call. By the fall of 1943, the inverted dive had spread through nearly every Lightning squadron in the region. The technique had become part of the unofficial creed of survival. And like any true wartime discovery, it thrived not because it was sanctioned, but because it worked. By October 1943, the tactic had evolved from rumor to ritual. It was no longer just a desperate trick. It was a way of life in the cockpit. Every fighter group in the Pacific had their version of it adapted to their aircraft's quirks. Some called it the Split S, others rolling out downward. But the message was identical when in doubt: invert and dive. At Port Moresby, Colonel Neil Kirby of the 348th Fighter Group, not Kirby, as history sometimes misprints, took it a step further. He was flying the P-47 Thunderbolt, a brute of an aircraft, heavy, muscular, and about as subtle as a falling anvil. The Jug, as pilots called it, couldn't dream of turning with a zero. But it could dive faster than almost anything alive. Kirby knew it. His philosophy was blunt, almost cruel. Try to turn with them and you'll die. Use your weight, use gravity, and you'll win. On October 11, 1943, Kirby proved it. He led his flight of P-47s over Wewak, spotted a formation of Japanese aircraft, and dove through them like a meteor. 6 enemy planes fell in a single mission, a record that earned him the Medal of Honor. The secret wasn't marksmanship. It was geometry. He used the vertical plane of combat, the same principle Bong and Lynch had discovered months earlier, to control when and how the fight happened. By early 1944, the Marine Corps had followed suit. On tiny island airstrips like Munda and Vella La Vella F-4U Corsair squadrons, began teaching their rookies the same thing: don't wrestle fall. The Corsair's big Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine could hold power through short bursts of negative Gs, and its thick wings could take the punishment. Major Robert Gaylor of the famed VMF 214 Black Sheep Squadron drilled it into his men. "You're not running," he said. "You're buying time, enough time to turn back and finish the job." Carrier squadrons soon joined in. On the flight decks of the USS Essex and Lexington, young Navy pilots watched chalk diagrams drawn under the tropical sun, a looping arrow rolling upside down, labeled only Option 3. The official paperwork still avoided mentioning G-words, but everyone knew. The new gospel had reached the fleet. Still, there were limits. The Hellcat's carbureted engine sometimes coughed during sustained inverted flight. The P-40 could handle the stress, but lacked the speed to make the dive count. Every airframe had its breaking point. But the core truth was universal vertical maneuvers beat horizontal dogfights every single time. Pilots began to view the sky differently. The old way, circling, turning, grinding for position, was two-dimensional, a chess game on a flatboard. Now, the fight had depth. The split S wasn't a retreat. It was a reset. A way to slip gravity's leash dive into chaos and come out above your enemy instead of beneath him. The Pacific skies had turned into laboratories. Each squadron was an experiment in survival, and the data was written not in ink, but in contrails and cannon smoke. The manuals hadn't caught up yet, but the pilots had. By late 1943, the Japanese began to notice something strange. Their after-action reports mentioned American fighters that would flip over and fall away like stones, only to reappear moments later, diving or climbing from unexpected directions. To many Zero pilots, it looked like cowardice, Americans running from a fight. That misunderstanding would prove fatal. The truth was that the Americans weren't fleeing. They were resetting the battle. The split S wasn't surrender, it was strategy. It broke the Zero's rhythm, forced its pilots into maneuvers their aircraft simply couldn't endure. Designed for grace and agility, the Zero was fragile when pushed to the edge. Its light frame, so perfect for tight turns, was never meant to handle the brutal loads of a high-speed inverted dive. Some Japanese tried to follow through those maneuvers. Many never came back. Reports from surviving pilots spoke of violent airframe vibration, wings shuddering like paper in a storm, engines sputtering mid-dive as fuel lines starved under negative Gs. Those who managed to pull out did so too early, losing sight and advantage. Others kept chasing, and their planes tore themselves apart in the thin air above the Pacific. One story from December 1944 over Leyte Gulf captures the brutal physics of that new air war. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas McGuire, flying a P-38, was jumped by 4 Zeros at 18,000 feet. When the lead Zero closed in, McGuire rolled inverted and dove straight into a storm of wind and sound. The Japanese pilot followed, pushing his own machine past the red line. McGuire's P-38 screamed past 450 miles per hour and held together. The Zero hit 380 and began to shake violently, its wings threatening to shear. The Japanese pilot pulled out defeated by his own aircraft. Moments later, Maguire leveled off at 6,000 feet, climbed back up, and shot down 2 of the 4 pursuers. The other 2 broke contact and vanished into cloud. It was a perfect demonstration of the war's new math. What once was an advantage had become a trap. The very qualities that made the Zero legendary in 1942, its agility, its feather-light frame, were now its undoing. As the Americans adapted, the Japanese design philosophy was becoming outdated by the week. Japanese engineers saw the problem too. Late-war prototypes like the J-2M Raiden tried to fix it with stronger structures and better high-speed performance. But it was too late. Japan was losing experienced pilots faster than it could replace them, and new recruits arrived with only a fraction of the training hours veterans had enjoyed. They were still taught the old ways, horizontal turns, formation dogfights. But the war had moved on. By the end of 1944, the Pacific skies had been transformed. The Zero, once the terror of the ocean, was now a relic of a vanished doctrine. American fighters ruled the vertical diving, rolling climbing, turning air and gravity into weapons. And somewhere above those cloud banks, the ghost of Thomas Lynch's first inverted dive still lingered, a reminder that even in war, survival belongs not to the strongest, but to the fastest learner. When the war finally tilted beyond recovery for Japan, the tactical transformation was already irreversible. The Split S, once a desperate improvisation whispered in jungle tents, had become embedded in the DNA of air combat. What began as an act of survival now stood as doctrine. After 1945, the lessons born over the Solomons and New Guinea didn't fade. They evolved. In Korea, a new generation of pilots flying jet-powered F-86 Sabres found themselves facing MiG-15s, sleek, fast, and shockingly agile. Once again, the Americans confronted an enemy who could outturn them horizontally. So they looked to the past. Veteran instructors, men who'd once flown P-38s and Corsairs, taught their students an old trick with a new name rolling out underneath. Captain Joseph McConnell, who would become the top American ace of the Korean War, later said, "If a MiG got behind me, I'd roll inverted pushdown and disappear for a second. When he came looking, I was gone." It was the same instinct that had saved Richard Bong. The same physics Thomas Lynch had trusted blind. By the time Vietnam erupted, the U.S. Navy had almost forgotten those hard-won lessons. Missiles and radar had replaced intuition. Pilots were told dogfighting was obsolete. Then, the MiGs proved everyone wrong. The Navy's early losses were a grim echo of 1942. Once again, American fighters trained for theory were dying against opponents who fought dirty and close. The response was the birth of Top Gun in 1969, a direct revival of the Pacific spirit. Instructors at Miramar taught negative G maneuvers, vertical fighting, and energy management, exactly as their grandfathers had discovered them 2 decades before. Modern aircraft, the F-16, F/A-18, and F-35, are designed with those principles built in. Their engines feed through G-forces. Their frames are built to survive both the crushing weight of a 9G climb and the strange inverted silence of a -3 push. In centrifuge chambers, young pilots today train to endure what Bong and Lynch once survived only by instinct. Their visors flash crimson, simulating red out, and the instructors tell them, "It's not pain, it's information. Fly through it." But beyond the steel and sensors, something deeply human endures. The Split S was never really about a maneuver. It was about courage, under uncertainty, the refusal to die according to anyone else's rules. The men who discovered it weren't textbook heroes. They were exhausted, afraid, and creative in the most dangerous way imaginable. Richard Bong, America's top ace with 40 victories, survived the war, still haunted by the memory of those seconds upside down over the Solomon Islands. Thomas Lynch, who first made the move deliberately, was killed in action over the Philippines in 1944. He died not because his tactic failed, but because air combat is a lottery where even genius can run out of luck. Their legacy doesn't hang in museums or medals. It lives in every pilot who still trains to roll inverted and push forward when cornered. 80 years later, the lineage is unbroken, from the desperate skies of the Pacific to the high-tech cockpits of today. In the end, the Split S wasn't born from theory or design, it was born from fear clarity, and that split second, when a man chooses to fly straight into the impossible. And for 2 heartbeats of red-tinted blindness, he rewrote the future of aerial warfare. To me, Bong's split-second choice wasn't just a maneuver, it was a moment where instinct defeated doctrine. It showed that in war, innovation is often born from fear, not theory. Those few seconds of red-out changed air combat forever. If stories like this make you see history differently, consider subscribing. There are many more forgotten moments waiting above the clouds.